Mary Holland, the President of Children's Health Defense, joining us from the U.S.
Thank you so much, Orsolia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you fine, Mary. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it's such a pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, and I want to thank Children's Health Defense Europe so much for arranging this. And I want to give a shout out in particular to Senta Depoyd, who got Children's Health Defense Europe off the ground. So my topic is law and order. Where is Justitia heading? And I want to start with order. I think the last 2 years have absolutely been on par with war. We've been living through a 2-year emergency, which the predators at play are using for a great reset. And it's a standard phrase of those in power that we should let no crisis go to waste. And certainly that's what COVID has really been all about for the billionaires behind much of this. So law, though, is a different animal than order. And sadly, the last 2 years have essentially been lawless. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the chair of Children's Health Defense, often points out that really none of what's happened in the last 2 years has been through lawful means. It has not been democratic. It has not been done through the legislatures. It's really not even been done through appropriate administrative channels. There has been no elections around this. There have been no referenda. There have been no notice and comment periods. There have been no hearings. Everything, the lockdowns, the masks, the tests, the coerced vaccination with experimental products, everything has been done on an emergency basis at warp speed. In the United States, of the 3 branches of government, the legal branch, the judicial branch, is known as the least dangerous branch. And I once heard Justice Sandra Day O'Connor point out that the pillars of justice at the front of the Supreme Court are on the backs of turtles. And her point was that justice is intended to move in a slow, deliberative, reasoned manner. It's never intended to work at warp speed in the way that an executive or a legislative branch can. But that is both the strength and the weakness of law as an instrument in the kind of settings that we're in now. Sadly, in the last 2 years, at least in the United States, which is my focus, the legislative branch has been essentially asleep. It's been supine, it's been lying down. The executive has had all of the authority. And essentially for the first almost year of the so-called pandemic, the courts were silent. The courts really didn't take any position until November 2020. But in November 2020, the US Supreme Court issued a decision called Roman Catholic Diocese versus Cuomo. And they basically said the pandemic does not permit arbitrary restrictions on the free exercise of religion. And that was very important, that they couldn't close down churches with arbitrary color coding, as Governor Cuomo in New York State was trying to do. And since November 2020, there have been many positive developments in law. So first, about half of the attorney generals in the United States opposed many of the pandemic restrictions. And they brought cases that wound their way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rejected the mandate that the Biden administration put in place for companies with over 100 workers. And the rationale of the court was that the administration did not, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration did not have the authority to enact that kind of a medical mandate. There was also a challenge brought by similar actors on behalf of federal workers. That case is still in limbo. And then the Supreme Court upheld the mandate for healthcare workers. But in other words, the courts have started to play a role here in terms particularly of authority. They have never reached the underlying issues really of, do these products work? Is it possible to coerce an experimental product? Those are not the issues they've really looked at. They've looked at easier legal issues so far of authority. But a very important recent decision from our friends at Leslie Manookian at Health Freedom Defense Fund was that the mandate of masks in federal transportation has now been lifted. That's being appealed, but right now people don't have to wear masks on planes and in trains. Our chapter in the state of California, one of the most repressive states in this area, just won a judgment that there can be no coercive vaccination mandate of COVID shots for children in the Los Angeles school district. That's the second largest school district in the country. We recently had a victory in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., where the city council there, which is just one chamber, not standard assembly and Senate, but one chamber, they passed a law that would allow children as young as 11 to consent to any federally recommended vaccine, including COVID shots. And we challenged that, as did the group ICANN, and we won a preliminary injunction that law cannot be enforced. And the district has decided not to challenge that. We are now in settlement negotiations. We also had a victory in New York. It's the largest school district in the country, and they were coercing children to take PCR testing, random nasal swab testing in the 2021 school year. And as a result, we believe, of our challenge, they made the testing voluntary in the most recent school year. Please pray for us. On Tuesday next week, we have two very important oral arguments. One in a case in a federal appeals court, the Ninth Circuit, against Facebook for working together with the government to censor Children's Health Defense. It's a case against Facebook and Zuckerberg. We are very hopeful that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals will send the case back to the trial court to say there has to be discovery. We have to see whether, in fact, Tony Fauci and Mark Zuckerberg, who we know were in email communication, were actually arranging for Facebook to do things that the government is prohibited from doing by the First Amendment. We also have a case on Tuesday, oral argument in the Western District of Texas against the FDA's authorization of COVID shots for children 5 to 11. We believe that there is no rational basis for that authorization, given that children are at zero statistical risk of death from COVID. I actually believe that there are many more legal victories in the future. We have 50 cases in the pipeline. And as I said, the law is not a fast instrument of change. It is, by design, a rather slow instrument of change. But the rest of my talk, the biggest point I want to bring across is that something I've learned kind of the hard way in the last 2 years is that courts follow culture. Public opinion is essential to being able to use the courts. And ultimately, it is the consent of the governed. It is public opinion that really makes the difference. Legal change is the last best chance. It's essential to have this final line of defense, but it's not the fastest, it's not the cheapest, and it's not the most effective path to change. The most effective is the most amorphous, but that is literally changing popular opinion. It seems to me that you all are there to talk about how do we unify efforts, how do we challenge the Great Reset, not just these sort of more isolated victories in particular areas. And I applaud you for being there and thinking about this. So I think we have to ask, how do we strengthen ordinary people's consciousness against the next pandemic that Bill Gates and the WHO, they're all telling us, just to be waiting for? It seems to me we want to get to the point where the person on the street just laughs and says, are you kidding me? Been there, done that. No way. I'm not doing that again. It seems to me that that's what we're after, that kind of rejection, almost as if it's absurd. So how do we persuade the public that the last 2 years was hideous because of Bill Gates, because of the WHO, because of the European Commission, because of US executive policy under both political parties? How do we convince the public and instill in the public the confidence that a technocratic, centralized, communistic, rigid, mechanistic, expensive approach to disease management didn't work again, and that we won't do it again? So how do we get there? It seems to me that we need to really reverse engineer the mass psychosis that, in fact, the powers that be did put in place over the last 2 years. We really do have to be working more closely, I think, with psychologists, with advertisers, with marketers, with this mass psychosis that we have lived through. I think we're all doing bits and pieces, but it is that kind of shift in the culture that is going to make the difference. And I do believe that we have made tremendous strides in public consciousness. I don't think that the mainstream media would be pivoting to the war in Ukraine or to the abortion debate in the United States were the channel of COVID 24/7 continuing to work. They've switched the channel to other high stakes, high emotion, high drama topics. But we know that come fall, it's just in the ordinary course, there will be more respiratory illness. And it's likely that by the fall, we will be re-indoctrinated with fear, fear, fear. Vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. Test, test, test. And I think our adversaries, to their credit, have really laid out their program, right? They are trying to get authorization for infants and young children in June this year. They've got more negotiations on the WHO treaty amendments by May 2024. They want to have the WHO new international instrument with basically a global nexus of control ratified and done. And they've told us by 2030, basically, we will live in global communism, right? You will own nothing and you will be happy. The US will not be the world's leading superpower. 1 billion people will have been displaced by climate change. Individual rights will be passé. They've done an extraordinary job of predictive programming about the Great Reset. So it seems to me that finally, I would just say that I think collective consciousness does matter, ideas do matter, and they can impact reality. And so I have come up with my own sort of 10-point mantra, which if it's of help to anybody else, I'm grateful. But I do think that there are forces beyond our full comprehension, which I would sort of dub as perfection, which happens to be 10 letters. So here are my 10 letters to keep in mind for myself, a plan. But I do believe that you all there in Sweden can help to come up with the actual timeline plans that are the equivalent on our side of what our adversaries are doing. But my 10-point words are perfection. So P, the pandemic paradigm is gone. E, emergency measures, gone. R, religious restrictions, gone. F, freedom restored. E, elections maintained. C, consent in all forms, absolutely essential, as in the Nuremberg Code. T, truth is on our side. I, institutions are restored, universities, employers, law enforcement to their original purposes. O, opposition in politics is celebrated. No cancel culture, no censorship. N, never again is now. We are up against the heirs of Nazi ideology. We are the resistance. And I don't think we know how we will win, but I do believe that if we persist, we will win. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. And I don't know with our delay whether you would have time for any questions. Can you hear us?
Sure.
Yeah. Any questions to Mary
Yes.
Holland? I would have one. Where do you see, Mary, the role of the decision makers, the government, Congress, the parliamentaries in Europe, in the European Union, in the national states, in the nation states?
Well, I can speak to the United States, Ursulia. I leave it to you all to explain the European Parliament. In the United States, we would hope for a sea change in the Congress in elections this November. I do believe that there is significant discontent, not only with COVID restrictions, but also with inflation, also with immigration, also with other areas of public discourse. And if there is a change in the ruling coalition in US Congress, we could absolutely look to real hearings, real investigations starting in January 2023. And I believe we could look to real legislative changes, Ursulia, so that we could really put in place laws that say you can't close things down, no lockdowns, no pandemic emergency restrictions, get out of the WHO, for instance, restore liability for emergency use products, make it an absolutely clear law by anybody. I think there's a lot of things that I pray between now and January. It's unrealistic for us to think that Congress will be able to do much given the support for the Biden administration.
It's green. It's on. Good. Thank you so much for. Thank you so much for that. This is particularly relevant given Robert Kennedy's work on environment and climate change. Do you see the risk of the merging of mega issues, merging climate change with the pandemic? They're already talking about climate change leading to many, many more pandemics. Thanks.
Yes, I absolutely think that that is something that we need to explore further. So I was just listening to James Corbett's review of the Bill Gates book, The Next Pandemic. I don't want to buy it, and I'm glad that he read it and gave us a thorough review. And in point of fact, he points out that at the end of the book seems to be the real reason that he wrote it. And that is tying together pandemics and climate change. And I do think that it's also fairly clear at this point that the manner in which the WHO's new capacities would be enforced, they don't have an army, obviously, would be through IMF, through World Bank, and it would be through financial incentives and punishments to the countries that would not go along with the new pandemic paradigm of surveillance and intervention, even over and above the national country's consent to that intervention. So I do think that what the WHO has on offer is very, very troubling and very dangerous. And I absolutely think that one of the things that is going to happen is that if it goes forward is the notion that, oh, there is climate change in this particular country in Africa. Let's say there's been erosion of the soil, there's been displacement, there's been storms. And because of that, it's a breeding ground for this new viral infection or bacterial infection. And that's the pandemic. And one of the things that seems quite clear is that in the WHO plan, this 3,000 person germ team, gets to sort of bomb into countries and say, oh, there's a pandemic, right? I mean, what's going to be the verification of that? It seems like it's a completely internal process where the WHO gets to decide what the pandemic is, how it gets handled, and then presumably in cooperation with the World Bank and IMF, gets to, stop loans, stop credit, stops access to funding, right? Much like what we've already seen most recently, in Canada and in Russia, of like just a full stop of the economic system, the global sort of economic access. So those are, I definitely think we're seeing increased intertwining of climate change and pandemic preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you for joining us. And we know that you are heading off to a protest. So very warm greetings to everyone there from Malmö, from Scandinavia. And thank you for being available earlier before takeoff. All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.